Jesus, the Last Great Initiate, by Edouard Schure. Preface. Scholarly criticism regarding the life of Jesus has, during the preceding century, emerged with significant prominence. A comprehensive chronicle of this critical discourse may be discovered within the luminous outline composed by Monsieur Sabatier, wherein the entirety of the history and the extant status of this investigation are detailed. It suffices for the immediate juncture to allude to the two principal phases furnished by Strauss and Renan, with the objective of defining the novel vantage point I now desire to proffer. Diverging from the philosophical school of Hegel to align himself with the critical and historical faction of Bauer, Strauss, without negating the actual existence of Jesus, endeavored to demonstrate that his life, as recounted within the Gospels, constitutes a myth. It is a legend forged by the popular imagination to satisfy the exigencies of a nascent Christianity, and remains in accordance with Old Testament prophecy. His position, a purely negative stance which he nevertheless defended with consummate skill and erudition, has been substantiated in specific details, yet determined to be quite untenable in its entirety and essential elements. It possesses, furthermore, the grave defect of elucidating neither the character of Jesus nor the genesis of Christianity. The life of Jesus, in accordance with the tenets of Strauss, resembles a planetary system devoid of a sun. One merit, however, must be conceded to this work, that of having transferred the problem from the terrain of dogmatic theology to that of textual and historical criticism. Monsieur Renan's Vie de Jesus attributes its brilliant success to its lofty, aesthetic, and literary qualities, as well as to the audacity of the author, who was the first to dare render the life of the Christ a problem of human psychology. Has he resolved the problem? Following the dazzling success of the tome, the consensus of all serious critics has remained in the negative. The Jesus depicted by Monsieur Renan commences his career as a gentle dreamer, an enthusiastic yet simple-minded moralist. He concludes it as a violent thaumaturgist, devoid of all conception of reality. Notwithstanding all the precautions of the historian, observes Monsieur Sabatier, it represents the progression of a healthy intellect in the direction of madness. The Christ of Monsieur Renan oscillates between the calculations of ambition and the reveries of a seer. The reality is that he becomes the Messiah without desiring, indeed almost without perceiving it. He permits himself to be accorded this appellation merely to gratify the apostles and to fulfill the popular aspiration. It is not with so feeble a faith that a genuine prophet establishes a new religion and alters the soul of the earth. The life of Jesus, according to Monsieur Renan, is a planetary system illumined by a pallid sun devoid of vivifying magnetism or creative heat. How did Jesus become the Messiah? That constitutes the primordial interrogation, the resolution of which is essential to the correct comprehension of the Christ. It is also that before which Monsieur Renan faltered and turned aside. Monsieur Theodore Keene perceived that this question must be confronted with boldness. His biography of Jesus stands as the most remarkable that has appeared since that of Monsieur Renan. It casts upon the inquiry all the illumination afforded by texts and history interpreted esoterically. Yet the problem is not one capable of resolution without the assistance of intuition and esoteric tradition. It is by means of this esoteric light, the inner flame of all religions, the central truth of all fruitful philosophy, that I have attempted to reconstruct, along its principal lines, the life of Jesus, whilst taking into account whatever previous historical criticism has hitherto cleared and prepared regarding the foundation. There is no necessity to define that which I signify by the esoteric point of view, the synthesis of religion and science. Regarding the historical and relative value of the Gospels, I have adopted the 3 synoptical Gospels as a basis, and that of John as the arcanum of the esoteric teaching of the Christ, while simultaneously acknowledging the subsequent language and form, as well as the symbolical tendency of this Gospel. All 4 Gospels, which ought to be mutually examined and verified, are equally authentic, although from differing claims. Those of Matthew and Mark are precious Gospels of the letter and of fact. Therein are to be discovered the public deeds and utterances of the Christ. The gentle Luke affords a glimpse of the mystery meaning beneath the poetical legend veil. It is the gospel of the soul, of woman, and of love. St. John unfolds these mysteries. Within his gospel are to be found the inner depths of the doctrine, the secret teaching, the significance of the promise, and the esoteric reserve. Clement of Alexandria, one of the few Christian bishops who possessed the key to universal esotericism, rightly designated it the Gospel of the Spirit. John possesses a profound insight regarding the transcendent truths revealed by the Master, and a great facility in presenting them. Accordingly, his symbol is the eagle, whose wing cleaves the firmament, and whose flaming eye encompasses the depths of space. Chapter 1. Crisis of Antiquity. A grave epoch in the destiny of the world was drawing near. The firmament was obscured by darkness and replete with sinister omens. Notwithstanding the endeavors of the initiates, polytheism, throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe, had culminated solely in the collapse of civilization. The sublime cosmogony of Orpheus, so gloriously intoned by Homer, had not been realized, and the only plausible elucidation is that human nature encountered profound difficulty in sustaining a certain intellectual altitude. For the eminent spirits of antiquity, the gods were never aught but a poetical expression of the subordinated forces of nature, a speaking image of its inner organism. It is as symbols of cosmic and anemic forces that these deities reside indestructibly within the consciousness of humanity. This diversity of gods and forces, the initiates conceived, was dominated and permeated by the supreme God or pure spirit. The primary objective of the sanctuaries of Memphis, Delphi, and Eleusis had been precisely the instruction of this divine unity, together with the theosophical concepts and moral discipline ensuing therefrom. Yet, the disciples of Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato faltered before the egoism of the politicians, the squalor of the sophists, and the passions of the populace. The social and political decomposition of Greece was the inevitable consequence of its religious, moral, and intellectual decay. Apollo, the solar word, the manifestation of the supreme God and the superterrestrial realm, remains silent. No further oracles, no further inspired poets are to be discerned. Minerva, wisdom and foresight, veils her countenance in the presence of her people transformed into satyrs, profaning the mysteries and affronting the gods in Aristophanic farces upon the stage of Bacchus. The mysteries themselves are corrupted, for sycophants and courtesans are granted admission to the Eleusinian rites. When the soul becomes obtunded, religion descends into idolatry. When thought becomes materialized, philosophy degenerates into skepticism. Thus we observe Lucian, that wretched microbe born of the corpse of paganism, subjecting the myths to ridicule, whereas formerly Carneades had denied their scientific origin. Superstitious in religion, agnostic in philosophy, egoistical and divided in politics, reeling under anarchy and fatally abandoned to despotism, Greece had become lamentably altered from the era when she transmitted the science of Egypt and the mysteries of Asia in immortal forms of beauty. If there existed one who comprehended the necessities of the world, and who endeavored to satisfy this want through an exertion of heroic genius, that individual was Alexander the Great. This legendary conqueror, initiated, as was his father, Philip, into the mysteries of Samothrace, demonstrated himself to be even more the intellectual heir of Orpheus than the disciple of Aristotle. Doubtless, the Achilles of Macedonia, who, accompanied by a mere handful of Greeks, traversed Asia as far as India, envisioned a universal empire, yet not after the manner of the Caesars, through the oppression of the populace and the obliteration of religion and unfettered science. His grand conception was to reconcile Asia and Europe via a synthesis of religions, buttressed by scientific authority. Impelled by this notion, he rendered homage to the science of Aristotle, just as he did to Minerva of Athens, the Jehovah of Jerusalem, the Egyptian Osiris, and the Hindu Brahma, recognizing, as would a veritable initiate, an identical divinity and wisdom beneath these divergent symbols. This new Dionysus possessed an expansive sympathy and a potent prophetic insight. The sword of Alexander typified the final brilliance of the Greece of Orpheus, illuminating both the East and the West. The son of Philip perished amidst the intoxication of victory and the glorious realization of his dream, leaving the fragments of his empire to selfish and rapacious generals. Yet his philosophy did not perish with him. He had established Alexandria, wherein Oriental philosophy, Judaism, and Hellenism were to be fused in the crucible of Egyptian esotericism, until the time might be mature for the resurrection word of the Christ. In proportion as Apollo and Minerva, the twin constellations of Greece, waned upon the horizon, the populace beheld a menacing portent, the Roman she-wolf, ascending in the turbulent sky. What is the origin of Rome? It is the conspiracy of an avaricious oligarchy, in the name of brute force, and the oppression of the human intellect, religion, science, and art, by deified political power. In other words, it represents the antithesis of truth, by which a government derives its justification, in accordance with the supreme principles of science, justice, and economy. The entirety of Roman history is merely the consequence of that iniquitous pact by which the conscript fathers declared war, first against Italy, and subsequently against the entire Roman race. They selected an apt symbol for the brazen she-wolf with tawny hackles erect and a hyena's head turned in the direction of the capital, constitutes the image of this government, the demon that shall possess the Roman soul unto the very end. In Greece, at least, the sanctuaries of Delphi and Eleusis were long respected. At Rome, from the very inception, science and art were repudiated. The endeavor of the sage Numa, that Etruscan initiate, failed before the suspicious ambition of the conscript fathers. He bore with him the Sibylline books, which contained a portion of the science of Hermes. He appointed magistrates elected by the populace, distributed territory, and submitted the right of declaring war to the official priests. Accordingly, King Numa, long cherished in the memory of the people, who regarded him as inspired by divine genius, appears to be a historical intervention of sacred science within the government. He represents not the genius of Rome, but rather that of the Etruscan initiation, which adhered to the same principles as the schools of Memphis and Delphi. Following Numa, the Roman Senate incinerated the Sibylline books, undermined the authority of the Flamens, destroyed arbitral institutions, and reverted to its archaic systems wherein religion was nothing more than an instrument of public domination. Rome became the hydra that engulfed the nations and their gods alongside them. The nations of the earth were gradually reduced to subjection and pillage. The Mamertine prison became replete with monarchs from the north and south. Rome, determined to countenance no kings other than slaves and charlatans, destroys the final possessors of esoteric tradition in Gaul, Egypt, Judea, and Persia. She feigns worship of the gods, yet the sole object of her adoration is the she-wolf. And now, afar upon the blood-stained dawn, there emerges the final progeny of this ravenous creature, the embodiment of the genius of Rome. Caesar. Rome has conquered all the nations of the earth. Caesar, her incarnation, arrogates unto himself universal power. He aspires not merely to become the ruler of mankind, for, uniting the tiara with the diadem, he causes himself to be proclaimed chief pontiff. After the battle of Thapsus, deification as a hero is voted to him. After that of Munda, divine apotheosis is granted by the Senate. His statue is erected in the temple of Quirinus, and a college of officiating priests is appointed, bearing his name. To crown all in irony and logic, this very Caesar who deifies himself denies, in the presence of the Senate, the immortality of the soul. Would it be possible to proclaim more overtly that there is no longer any god other than Caesar? Under the Caesars, Rome, inheritor of Babylon, extends her dominion over the entire world. What has become of the Roman state? It is engaged in the destruction of all collective life, save for governors and tax collectors in the provinces. Conquering Rome feeds like a vampire upon the corpse of an exhausted system. And now the Roman orgies are openly and publicly displayed with all their bacchanalia of vice and iniquity. They commence with the voluptuous meeting of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and shall conclude with the debaucheries of Messalina and the insane frenzy of Nero. They announce their presence through a licentious and public mockery of the mysteries, destined to culminate within the Roman circus. There, unclothed virgins, martyred for their creed, are rent asunder and consumed by ferocious beasts amidst the acclamation of thousands of onlookers. Nevertheless, amongst the nations subjugated by Rome, there existed one which designated itself the people of God, possessing a genius diametrically opposed to that of Rome. How did it come to pass that Israel, exhausted by internecine conflict and crushed by 3 centuries of servitude, preserved its indomitable faith? Wherefore did this subjugated populace arise, in the manner of a prophet, to oppose Greek decadence and Roman debauchery? From whence did they derive the fortitude to foretell the downfall of masters who held their feet upon the nation's throat, and to speak of some nebulous ultimate triumph, whilst they themselves approached irremediable ruin? The explanation resides in the fact that a monumental concept, inspired by Moses, endured within the nation. Under Joshua, the 12 tribes had erected a commemorative stele bearing the inscription, "This is a testimony between us that Jehovah is God alone." The legislator of Israel had established monotheism as the cornerstone of his science and social jurisprudence, as well as of a universal religious concept. He possessed the genius to comprehend that the future of humanity would depend upon the triumph of this ideal. To preserve it, he had inscribed a hieroglyphic tome, constructed a golden ark, and raised a people from the nomadic dust of the wilderness. Upon these witnesses to the spiritualistic idea, Moses called down the lightning flash and the thunderbolt from the heavens. Conspiring against them were not only the Moabites, the Philistines, the Amalekites, and all the tribes of Palestine, but even the frailties and passions of the Jewish people themselves. The book ceased to be comprehended by the priesthood. The ark was seized by adversaries, and numerous were the occasions when the populace nearly consigned their mission to oblivion. Why, then, notwithstanding all, did they remain faithful to this mandate? Why had the concept of Moses remained engraved upon the brow and heart of Israel in letters of fire? To whom is owed this exclusive perseverance, this magnificent fidelity amidst the vicissitudes of a tumultuous history, a fidelity that bestowed upon Israel a unique character among nations? It may boldly be attributed to the prophets and the institution of prophecy. Through oral tradition, it may be traced back to Moses. The Hebrew people have possessed a Nabi at all epochs of their history, even unto their dispersion. However, the institution of prophecy first manifests in an organic form during the era of Samuel. It was he who founded the confraternities of Nebiim, those schools of prophets, in the face of a rising monarchy and an already degenerate priesthood. He established them as austere guardians of the esoteric tradition and the universal religious thought of Moses against the kings, in whom the political concept and national objective were to predominate. Within these confraternities were preserved the relics of the science of Moses, the sacred music, the occult art of healing, and finally, the art of divination, exercised by the great prophets with masterly force and abnegation. Divination has existed under the most diverse forms among all peoples of the ancient cycle. However, prophecy in Israel possesses an amplitude, a loftiness, and an authority belonging to the intellectual and spiritual nature in which monotheism sustains the human soul. The prophecy presented by theologians literally as the direct communication of a personal God, and denied by naturalistic philosophy as mere superstition, is, in reality, nothing less than the superior manifestation of the universal laws of the Spirit. The general truths which govern the world, as Edouard observes in his exquisite work on the prophets, or in other terms, the thoughts of God, are immutable and unassailable, entirely independent of the fluctuations of matter or the will and action of men. Man is originally intended to participate in them and to translate them freely into actions. Yet, for the word of the Spirit to enter into carnal man, he must be fundamentally influenced by the great commotions of history. Then, the eternal truth bursts forth like a flash of illumination. This is why we so frequently read in the Old Testament that Jehovah is a living God. When man heeds the divine call, a new life is created within him. No longer does he perceive himself as solitary, but rather in communion with God and all truth, ready to proceed eternally from one verity to another. In this new existence, his thought becomes unified with the universal will. He possesses a lucid comprehension of the present and total faith in the ultimate success of the divine idea. The man who experiences this is a prophet. He feels himself irresistibly impelled to manifest before others as a representative of God. His thought becomes vision, and this superior potency which forces the truth from his soul, at times with heart-breaking anguish, constitutes the prophetic element. The prophetic manifestations, throughout history, have acted as the thunderbolts and lightning flashes of truth. From this spring, those giants, Elijah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, drew their might. Whether deep within their caves or within the palaces of kings, they were indeed the sentinels of Jehovah, and, as Elisha said to his master Elijah, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen thereof. Frequently do they foretell, with prophetic vision, the demise of kings the collapse of kingdoms, and the retributions to be visited upon Israel. At times they are mistaken. The prophetic torch, though ignited by the sun of divine truth, will vacillate and darken in their hands under the influence of national passion. Yet, never do they waver concerning moral truths, the authentic mission of Israel, or the final triumph of justice for mankind. As true initiates, they preach their disdain for external worship, the abolition of blood sacrifices, the purification of the soul, and the practice of love. It is with regard to the final triumph of monotheism, its liberating and pacificatory role for all nations, that their vision is truly remarkable. The most frightful misfortunes that can befall a nation, foreign invasion, captivity in Babylon, cannot perturb their faith. Hearken to what Isaiah declared during the invasion of Sennacherib. Rejoice ye with Jerusalem, and be glad with her, all ye that love her. Rejoice for joy with her, all ye that mourn for her, that ye may suck and be satisfied with the breasts of her consolations, that ye may milk out and be delighted with the abundance of her glory. For thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. Then shall ye suck, ye shall be borne upon her sides, and be dandled upon her knees. As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. And when ye see this, your heart shall rejoice, and your bones shall flourish like an herb. And the hand of the Lord shall be known toward his servants, and his indignation toward his enemies. For, behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, and the abomination, and the mouse, shall be consumed together, saith the Lord. For I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come, that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. It is only before the tomb of the Christ that this vision begins to find realization. Yet who could deny its prophetic veracity when contemplating the role Israel played in the history of mankind? No less resolute than this faith in the future of Jerusalem, in its moral grandeur and religious universality, is the faith of the prophets in a Savior or a Messiah. Although they all speak of him, it is the incomparable Isaiah whose vision possesses the greatest lucidity, and who depicts it with the utmost force in bold, lofty language. There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. It shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. Before this vision, the typically melancholic soul of the prophet attains tranquility and clarity, much like a tempest-troubled sky settling after a storm. For it is, in truth, the image of the Galilean that manifests before his inner gaze. For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.